graphic designers are one of the biggest and most important users of type. And it's very important for the two groups to have this continued dialogue, because a typeface designer that is not in touch with the users of the services they provide is kind of like a bank that is not familiar with the needs of its clients. So to the point that if a client calls and asks for a service, they will pretend to take down her name and then send her not what she called for at all, but something she doesn't need, like a checkbook. So I have practiced many a signature for Ms. Sahar Afshar. But this sort of communication between type designers and graphic designers is a topic that keeps coming up and up over and over again. This article by Brian LaRosa, which was published a few weeks ago, caused some debates. In the article, he goes through the history of our profession and how type designers and graphic designers were at the beginning one and the same, and then eventually, with the divide, this sort of gap started to form between the two, and the communication became less and less frequent. Type Twitter had a lot of feelings about this, but regardless of how you feel about it, it is very good to keep this in mind and to remind ourselves of this thing of who is it that we design for? And I think that's really important, this question to keep in mind. On the surface, it seems like an easy enough question to answer. If you're doing a library font, then you probably have a rough idea of who the user is in your mind as you're designing. And if you're commissioned to do a font, then you're designing for your client. Except your client usually isn't going to be the person who is going to read in the font that you finally provide them with, right? The client will provide you with the general outline of what it is that they want the font to look like, and they will tell you what environments they expect it to perform in, but more often than not, they're not going to be actually reading in it. So really, we are designing for readers. And this is when I think what is the most important phase of a typeface design project begins, and that is the research. Now, quite often when we hear of research as a part of the design process, we're told to research the scripts that we are going to be designing for themselves, right? To answer questions like, how do letters behave in this particular script? What tools were used to write with the script? And what did that mean for things like modulation and contrast placement? What is the history of the writing system that we're designing for? All questions which are very valid and important to know the answers to, but what I think is equally, if not more so important, is this question of who are we designing for? Where are they from? What typefaces do they usually read in? How do they interact with these typefaces on a daily basis? And what is their history and what is their culture? And very, very importantly, what are their shared values, traditions, views, and institutions? And I think it's the answer to questions like these that frame that what it is in academia is referred to as social imaginary. Before all of your eyes glaze over at the very mention of academia, I promise I'm going to keep this bit really short, but just to open it up a little bit, I'm going to quote two writers that have dedicated much research and have written extensively about social imaginary, the first of which is John Thompson. In his book, Theory of Ideology, he calls it the creative and symbolic dimension of the social world, the dimension through which human beings create their ways of living together and their ways of representing their collective life. In his fantastic book, Imaginary Communities, which I think is a very important read, Benedict Anderson is concerned with the nation as an imaginary community, which is constructed through these shared frames of interpretation by the use of means such as print and media, which is us. It's what we do, right? And he says that the fellow members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them, yet in the minds of each lives the image of the communion, Communities are to be distinguished not by their falsity or genuineness, but in the style in which they're imagined. So, to put it more simply, the values, the traditions, the institutions, and the viewpoints that collectively glue together a group of people is a social imaginary. These viewpoints might be very different perspectives on the same thing, as illustrated in this cartoon drawn by Sampe. So, having gained an understanding of what it is that I'm talking about, then this question arises of what role does what we do, type design, play in relation to it? To answer that, I think we should first evaluate whether the outlines of a given letter change according to the aesthetic preferences of a region. In other words, an A is always an A. But does the way this A is shaped hold significance to a particular social imaginary? Type history tells us that it does. Consider the Johnson typeface. It's used in London Underground. Johnson is through and through a British typeface. It exudes Britishness, and any typeface that's based on it, like the transport typeface designed by Margaret Calvert and Jacques Kinnear in the 50s, also communicates a spirit and quality that is unmistakably British. It's identifiable by it. And a more clear example, perhaps, and I owe a big thank you to Amy of Alphabet's fame for helping me find this. It can be seen here in a recent tweet from Commercial Type. The same concept, right? A modern, high contrast serif design can have unique outlines that make it feel more French, Italian, or British. So, this is very much a global thing. But as with most things, it's much less talked about in regards to the Arabic script. Yet in my experience as a type designer and consultant for the Arabic script, there are very, very strong regional preferences that affect the shaping of letters across the Arabic script using parts of the world. And as you can see, it's a broad scope. So just considering the fact that you have Morocco all the way in the west to China in the east, and if you move through these regions, the culture changes, the histories change drastically. So how could we expect this to not be the case, that there will be regional preferences? Not just now and with an eye to type, but historically as well. If we look at various calligraphic models for writing Arabic, we'll see that as the script spread from one region to the next, the outlines consistently shifted and changed as well. Sometimes the change was more drastic, as in the case of Sini. Sini is a style that's used in China, and it owes its particular forms and shaping to the fact that calligraphers and scribes started writing Arabic using the Chinese ink brush. And it resulted in this beautiful, the beautiful organic curves and the shapes here that are flowing very beautifully in this ribbon-like style. And it's entirely unique to the region. Here in Istanbul, and the government offices of the Ottoman Empire, for calligraphic styles, a bit of a debate about that, some people say too, were combined to create the Ruka style of writing. It's very different from Sini, right? Ruka is marked by the use of these short clip lines and fast transitions. And here, very clearly, we can see that straight lines are preferred over curves, and the simplified nature of this style makes it highly legible and easy to read. It was primarily used in correspondence. And where I come from, these short straight lines gave way to the elegant curves of the Nastaliq style, which is widely recognized as the national style of Iran, and it's used all over the country in a variety of contexts, from books of poetry and high literature to advertisements for auto repair. This is just 3 examples that I have here of calligraphy, but then I didn't want to dwell on it too much because these preferences are not just mementos from a time long past. They're still very much applying today. So let's consider the case of writing manuals in Iran and Lebanon. And thank you to Aza for providing me with the Lebanese example. So on the right side, the pink workbook there, you can see the Lebanese version, which is using ruka as a template for writing the letter shin. So you have that quick pen movement where the entire letter is written with one stroke, whereas in Iran, in the example here, on the top line, you can see that the same letter is being written with slow, deliberate curves and a cascade that is reminiscent of the Nassalif style. So already at age 6, you begin to internalize this idea of how letters should look. And then there's the influence of other sources of text. You have widely popular children's storybooks. You don't grow up in Iran without reading or hearing of Hassani, who had no friends until he went to the hammam and washed up. Or cartoons and animations that you watch as a child. So here you can see a lettering example from an Iranian graphic designer called Murtaza Momayez. And again, you see the preference of curves and the careful balance of the black and white. Posters, a very good way of gauging these differences. They're made for the general public, right? They're displayed in places that have high visibility. And posters like these that are from a pre-digital era were the only means of drawing in would-be audiences to cinemas. So they would be drawn to match what people would like enough to spend money and go into the theater and sit down to see the movie. There was no Rotten Tomatoes. So the examples here are from Egypt, and a majority of posters from this time in Egypt are set in ruka. Whether you have speed lines, like the example on the far side there for Qatar al-Layl, whether you have these choppy sort of styled outlines, whether it's a smooth, fast writing style, the preferred style is still ruka. Whereas in Iran, you will almost never see ruka used, and especially not in movie posters. Instead, you find these softer, curvier letters. Newspapers, they can also be good indicators of what the general public is partial to. This example from Karachi is using nas tariq. Not nas tariq as we saw in my previous slides, but this is a style that is specifically referred to as Urdu nas tariq. It's different. The setting is more compact, the proportions are somewhat different, and there is a sharpness to it that you can't see in nas tariq as it exists in Iran. And people are comfortable reading in this style. In fact, they insist on it. Whereas in Iran, where nas tariq, we talked about it, originated, and people like it quite a bit, newspapers look like this. You don't expect to encounter nas tariq in a text setting in a newspaper in Iran. You instead expect to see a typeface like Nazanin with features that are very particular to the tastes of Iranians. Features like the blunt cuts on the bottom of descenders, like the re and the vav, or like this oval-shaped meme, and again, a typeface that has curved connections and more white space. Whereas if we consider the case of Kuwait, we encounter newspapers that look something like this, made distinct by the general darker color of text, the denser spacing, and sharp corners and transitions, and a heavy horizontal presence on the baseline. And very importantly, the use of, it's very confusing, Arabic numerals, which aren't actually Arabic, but are Latin. Yeah. This can clearly be seen in correspondence from Linotype regarding their newspaper types in the 70s. On one occasion, on the 2nd of July, 1971, the blue one here on this side, the highlighted part says, as you know, opinions about type design vary from one place to another. We have had ample evidence that Yakut, similar to what we saw in the previous slide in the Kuwait newspaper, is not liked by everyone in Iran, though it is widely approved in other areas. It was for that reason that Iran Chop produced their own design of typeface for Etelaat on the simplified principle. 4 years later, the other memo written by Walter Tracy on the topic of a separate Farsi design, Walter Tracy says, it is to be hoped that this can be avoided because such a face is unlikely to be of any interest to customers in the Arab world outside Iran. If the subject can be avoided, well and good. It was the 70s and things were different. Now, all of what I've been talking about so far circles around how people actually interact with texts and how people grow accustomed to seeing letters, but social imaginary is concerned with more than that. It also concerns itself with the day-to-day, with the culture, and with the customs of people. If you grow up looking at the abstract geometrical patterns of a gape, this carpet that you see here, you begin to grow an appreciation for the simple knotted designs, and this process of unconscious assimilation starts to happen, which means that probably, if you look at forms like these, they might feel familiar. A gape, from the Persian language Farsi, it means raw, unnatural, uncut. It represents a rough and primitive carpet with patterns mostly made by Qashqai nomads, which are from the Farsi province in the southwest of Iran. They are characterized by an abstract design that relies upon big open fields of color and of playfulness with geometry. Sorry, I'm going to cut this short. So when we look at something based off the credits that were just rolling from a movie called Gape, while many of us here might have an appreciation for the bizarre forms and many might not like them at all, a hint of nostalgia and this feeling of familiarity might set apart someone who grew up with a gape in their bedroom. Yeah? And this is also echoed elsewhere, like in the important role that calligraphic styles play in creating a public space in terms of social and aesthetic performance, or lessons in context that we know without being told. To me, thuluth, the style that you see here in the green, always has religious overtones, because I've seen it time and time again in the inscription of holy names and in mosques. Thuluth is marked for me by Shia's mourning during the Ashura and the saturated greens used in these settings, or as the blue as the lapis lazuli colored tiles of a mosque. Because of course, as a designer who spent many years in Iran and has been writing the Arabic script all of her life, I am not outside this. I am not outside the influence of my social imaginary. So when I work to design an Arabic companion to a Latin typeface, such as the case of Portada Arabic, I think you might remember Vic and Jose in their keynote mentioned Portada briefly. So the beautiful Latin is their design. And of course, I take note of the design decisions in the Latin, and they inform what I will do in the Arabic. But even then, I can't help but be partial to curves, soft corners, dot positioning and spacing that is lingering close to the lessons I learned from calligraphy rather than what I see as being done in other typefaces. And then, this is the first time I'm showing this, it's a work in progress. But there's also the case of when I'm drawing an Arabic typeface from something that I would not find in Iran. Take, for example, this. It's based off 7 letters I found in an Egyptian movie poster, Al-Raheba. For me, it was really interesting to try and marry this lettering that maybe doesn't feel Iranian, but injecting that feeling of it not being entirely foreign to an Iranian audience by adding shapes informed by my own handwriting. For example, this is actually a good, clear example of it. The case of the final Ain. Usually you expect to see something similar to what I've done for Portada Arabic on the left. And that is, of course, these are very different. One is a display and one is a text. So depending on context, I decided to change that. In Portada Arabic, the instroke goes up, twists around, creates a counter by looping down over the first stroke. For the newer typeface, I follow what happens in handwriting. The instroke goes up, the counter is created by pulling the pen back and connecting to the original stroke before finishing down in the descending bowl. Or for example, in the shaping of the isolated lam alif ligature, this is not something you'll find in calligraphy. It's not something you'll find in other typefaces. It's something that people might do in handwriting. And when you see it in the proper context, it will make sense. So, sort of echoing what Peter was saying before, we have technology now that allows, and we've had it for a while, right? It allows us to create a typeface that has this dynamic lettering style because with OpenType features, you can draw as many contextual alternates as you want. You can draw a contextual alternate for letters that, just as with handwriting, change according to what letters come before or after them, and then you have the added benefit of fine-grained control over things like dot positioning. So something like that. Or the interword spacing between the white space that exists between connecting pairs. And with the OpenType features, again, Peter said this earlier, we no longer have some of the limitations that existed beforehand. So if you don't use this possibility, it's now entirely designer's choice. It's not technical limitation. And this is a way in which technology feeds into and makes possible catering to the specific needs of a script. Is that playing? Okay. And this also applies the other way around, where handwriting and the way in which a script behaves can also encourage technical advancement. For example, the work we did with my partner in crime, Jose Sode, who's here, we took advantage of this idea of an organic curved variable Kashida as seen in handwriting, and we used that as a start point for a proposal for a variable font axis we named Gext. This is just a short clip from the whole video where we talk about this in a presentation at Typo Labs, and the presentation is online and it's an hour long, so I'm not gonna go into this in any depth. You can see it there. But just to put it very shortly, this axis provides the possibility to extend parts of a glyph, hence its name, glyph extension, Gext. Okay, I mentioned axis. I'm on theme for the conference, so I'm going to give you some concluding thoughts. Having said all this, I recognize that there isn't always time to engage in proper research for every typeface that we design in the real world. Type exists on this demand and supply structure. And with Arabic especially, most of the times there's a limited budget, so you're lucky if you get to expand it to cover the specific needs of 3 languages at most. That's why for Athelas Arabic, again, available, oh, have you been hearing me this whole time? I'm sorry. Yeah, I project quite a bit. That's why for Athelas Arabic, again, available through Type Together, I really wanted to create a very wide character set that catered to the needs of scripts that currently have less typographic variety, like Jawi and Sindhi. So right now it helps to fill a gap. And Athelas, when I came onto the project, it already had a Greek expansion, it had a Cyrillic, so I felt like for the Arabic, it would maybe be nice to go the extra mile. So right now, it is filling a gap, but with growing global markets and a field that continues to get more and more competitive, the importance of engaging with people's stories, of designing for specific groups to fill in gaps in their typographic needs, and bringing style to your work are only going to become more and more pertinent with the passing of time. You need to engage with social imaginaries to design for them, and in return, be inspired by them. There's nothing here, so guys, listen to me. At no point in my talk was I trying to say that any one of these styles is better than the other. Very important. Good type design, to my mind, is design that is done with the reader in mind and not just the personal preferences of you as the designer. So it becomes about embracing differences. And I don't know where I read this, but I read this online. This is not a quote from me. But you have to understand that other people might like something that you don't, and vice versa. It's still your job to design for them. So, to conclude, for anyone that's curious, I did try to follow up with my bank, this time in person, and I think the person helping me genuinely felt bad about the name situation, so they promised me they would see to getting it fixed. Great job. And I'm going to end on a quote from my teacher, a magnificent man who was a teacher to many of us in this room. In his book, A Theory of Typeface Design, Gerard says, "A benefit of knowing about the history of type design is the possibility to build on the past, to chart developments from past to present, and to extend these into the future." If you take anything away from this talk, let it be his words. Thank you very much.